Welcome to part 4 of the pile optimization process. In our last video, we brought in terrain and we put trackers on that terrain. As you can see over here, we have some larger than average piles, some coming up as high as 125 feet. This is because on our site, we have a larger than average slope. And in order to keep the tracker slope consistent, the piles need to be very tall. So one of the ways we can eliminate these unusually tall piles is to isolate some problem areas and remove them. So what we're going to do is come back over to our property analysis panel, and we're going to colorize objects for clarity. We saw in the previous videos, each color is a tracker that corresponds to a certain property, and we have set this as tracker frame piles length. So all of the greens are the trackers that are on the lower side, ranging up to the reds, which are on the higher end. So let's say we want everything that's 20 feet and over. We come right up here to horizontally select. We select that point and we drag it across. Now we have all of those trackers selected. You could then come up here to Edit, Boundary, Create a Round Selected. That gives you an option to create an offset. We're going to leave it at 5 feet and hit OK. And if we look in here, we see that it has created boundaries around everything that's selected. Now we could just come over to our Model Explorer, select all those boundaries, make them all exclusion zones. But there are some kind of areas over here where there's a few odd trackers that aren't included or a few odd ones that are. So this is maybe not the most realistic way of doing this. So I'm going to undo that. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate some areas where there's a lot of blue and red. I'm going to come up here to Edit, Boundary again, but we're going to select the first Create option, and this will allow us to just kind of freehand draw a boundary. So I'm going to add my points and just kind of loosely go around. And of course, as usual, depending on your workflow, we can go very carefully around, or you could just kind of generally make a shape. Whatever is going to work best for your workflow. Okay, and you can of course always come in and make adjustments to these points if needed, like that. And once we have a shape that we like here, we can hit OK, Escape, come over to the object details, and just like at the beginning of this project, make it an exclusion zone and change the color red. And now I'm going to go around and I'm going to do that in a few other of these areas and come right back. Okay, so I've gone in and I've added some more boundaries, and I've even come over here and I've stretched out an existing boundary to include a particularly rough patch. So there's a couple ways we can do this from here. We could come to our Model Explorer and select all of our new boundaries, come over to Selection, and then select objects inside selected boundaries, and then delete these out. From there, we would come over to the Layout panel, and we'd come over to this tab here that says Augment, and what it would do is adjust based on what it sees in the scene, so it's not regenerating the whole system. This is good because it will keep everything on the terrain, so it's going to be a little easier, but as you may have noticed, it is a little more heavy-handed with what it deletes, like it deleted out this whole section here. So if you're trying to keep your DC fairly high, this might not be the right solution for you. If you've got plenty of space, this is definitely the easier way to do it. However, let me undo. So I've undone that. And now what we can do is come over here to the Layout panel. Instead of augmenting, we're going to regenerate, because it's going to relay these things that didn't fit exactly in here. It's going to relay them out, so we can squeeze a little bit more DC out of the system this way. So you'll notice right now we're at 1.13 gigawatts in size. So in order to rerun this, You'll notice here it says 9 boundaries is what's selected. We obviously have way more, and that's because the new ones that were just added haven't been taken into account yet. So we're going to double click that, and it'll get all 23 boundaries. We'll hit OK, and then we will regenerate layout. Okay, so that's done generating, but if you'll notice, when we come back to our terrain and piles, which we will want to run again, because whenever we fully generate a layout, it's going to flatten everything. So to check where we're at with our piles, we're going to update piles. Okay, so now that that is done running, we're going to come back up to our layout tab, and we're going to see that our total DC power has dropped pretty significantly. It's down to 1.04 gigawatts from 1.13. However, if we come over here to the property analysis panel, you see that our max pile height was 125. It is now 73.5. That is a huge cut. Because these areas that we removed had pretty dramatic slopes, and we can check that by coming to the terrain analysis. And if you come over to elevation and you autofill, you can see that there is some pretty intense changes in elevation happening through here. In fact, we could probably even get rid of more of this. So this is another way you could freehand draw your boundaries, is by coming in here and looking at the terrain analysis and looking at the north-south slope and the elevation. We're going to change that back to transparent for now. So if we come over and colorize our objects, we can see that it's looking a lot better now. Our light and darker greens are now representing under 20 feet, and that seems to be the majority of what we're seeing here now. So we could continue to cut away the larger piles, or there's another solution where we can adjust the slope of the trackers. So if I come over to one of these trackers and press C to open a section box, you can see that so far everything we've been doing have been using rigid trackers, which means they maintain the same slope the entire time, regardless of what the terrain is doing. So you can see here, it starts very close to where the terrain is. And because it's sloping down so dramatically, we end up with a very tall pile here at the end. We can set all or certain trackers to be terrain following trackers. And that's the kind of tracker that's going to change slope from pile to pile, and it's going to follow along with the slope of the terrain. Now, obviously, in a perfect world, we could just set this entire thing to terrain following trackers and call it a day. But that might get a little bit expensive. So what we can do is we can once again come over to our property analysis panel, and we can horizontally select. And let's say this time we're going to go about 13 feet and up. Okay, so we've selected that range. And with those selected, we can come up here to edit, scene, and we're going to isolate. You could also just press Shift H. Okay, so now we have just the trackers that we want selected, isolated. And we're going to come back to our terrain and piles menu. We're going to select equipment this time. We're going to select equipment from scene. And we're going to loop around so that we can get all of these. And we're going to do that by holding down Control and clicking and dragging. Okay, so now that we have all of those selected, we're going to come down here to our solar array limits. We're going to leave our slope along axis the same, but for slope change bay to bay, we're going to set it at 1.5%. This is going to change depending on the manufacturer of the tracker. In this example, we're going to use 1.5% for slope change bay to bay. And then cumulative slope, we're going to put as 15%. So let's update the piles. All right, so that's finished running. Now we're going to show all by either coming up to Edit, Scene, and then Show All or Control H. And now if you look, we've gone from 74 to 73 feet as our max pile height. Where it's really helpful is in these middle areas where it takes things from being in the darker green to pulling it up into the lighter green. So let's colorize objects. and you'll see that we're getting a lot more light green than dark. So it's not going to help us in these super extreme situations. So let's look at an example. Say, let's come up here and grab one of these trackers here, and then press C. You're going to see how the slope is changing. It goes up and then curves down, and even it's starting to curve back up a little because it is changing as the slope goes from pile to pile. And that is much different than the rigid trackers we saw before, where this would just be at the highest point and then straight across, maintaining that same slope. Now, we've done this using 1.5 and 15%. This is going to vary depending on your manufacturer, how much of a percentage and how much of slope change you can do. We could also come here and change the slope along axis. And we can use these two techniques to work on shortening up these piles even more. We can come in and cut out more using the boundaries method. We can make more things terrain following trackers. This is depending on the slope until we're in a more reasonable range to begin cutting and filling. And just remember that as you're going through, you're going to want to keep up with the workflow of adjust the boundaries, either augment or regenerate. And if you regenerate, you'll need to place back on piles. You'll want to make sure you're placing everything on piles that have the slope change beta bay and cumulative set back to 0. And then you come back in again, isolate what you want to be terrain following trackers, and then run just those terrain following trackers. So make sure we do it in that order. And then once we have our piles down to a reasonable stage, I'm going to aim for, let's say, 20 feet. Then we can begin the process of cutting and filling. And we'll get into that in the next video.